His hands were steady. His hands had always been steady. It was one of the last things that still belonged entirely to him. That evening, Walter sat in his truck in the parking lot of the Clarksburg Public Library and cried. He had not cried in 30 years. Not when his father died. Not when the bank sent the first foreclosure notice. Not when he signed the papers that ended 40 years of Marsh Hardware and Supply and handed the building over to Conrad Hale's real estate company for a price that felt like being paid to disappear. Conrad's offer had come in at 60% of what the building was actually worth. Walter had known it. He had signed anyway because 60% of something is more than 100% of nothing, and they had run out of time. He cried now. Quietly, the way men of his generation cry without sound, with his hands flat on his thighs and his jaw set hard, just the water moving down his face like something that had been building behind a dam for longer than he'd admitted. Through the library window, he could see Dorothy. She was reshelving books in the large print section, moving slowly along the cart, her white hair catching the overhead light. She wore the reading glasses she'd had for 6 years, the ones with the slight scratch on the left lens, that she refused to replace because they still worked fine. She moved with the careful efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime making do with exactly what was available, and the sight of her 74 years old reshelving library books, because they needed the income compressed, something in his chest that he didn't have a word for. She deserved better than this. They both did. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, started the truck, and waited for her to come out. Clarksburg, West Virginia was the kind of town that had built its identity around its own steadiness. The same families in the same houses, the same churches, on the same corners, the same names on the same storefronts for generations. It was a place that prided itself on knowing its people, who they were, where they came from, what they were worth. And it was that last measurement that had quietly, ruthlessly shifted. Walter and Dorothy Marsh had been part of Clarksburg's furniture for 52 years. They had married young, built the hardware store from a rented space on Mill Street into a proper building on the corner of 4th and Carpenter, raised 3 children, sat on the volunteer fire department board, coached Little League, donated to the food pantry, helped dig out neighbors after the flood of 1998. They had been the kind of people communities are built around, not famous, not wealthy, but present, reliable, known. That version of the Marshes still existed in the town's memory, but memory, Walter had learned, has a short shelf life when money runs out. The hardware store had begun failing 4 years before it closed. The slide was gradual at first, a slowdown in foot traffic, then a drop in the accounts that used to anchor them, the contractors and small builders who discovered they could get better pricing at home base. Walter had adapted. He specialized. He offered things the big box stores couldn't: expertise, custom orders, the ability to look a man in the eye and tell him exactly what he needed for a specific job. For a while it worked well enough, then it didn't. The final 2 years were a controlled demolition, loans taken out to cover payroll, savings drawn down quarter by quarter. Dorothy's retirement account, which they had agreed was untouchable, touched. The inventory reduced, then reduced again, until the shelves that had once held everything a working man could need began to look sparse and apologetic. They closed in October, paid their debts, sold the building. When the accounting was finished, Walter and Dorothy Marsh had arrived at 76 and 74, with no savings, no retirement income beyond a modest Social Security payment, no home equity. The house had been mortgaged to keep the store alive, and a combined monthly income that required both of them to work to cover rent on a small apartment on Belden Street. Losing the money was survivable. What followed was harder. The shift in Clarksburg was not dramatic. There was no single moment when the town turned its back. It happened the way water erodes stone, gradually through repetition, until one day you look at the surface and realize the shape has fundamentally changed. Former customers who had walked through the door of Marsh Hardware twice a week for 20 years suddenly found reasons to look at their phones when Walter passed them at the gas station. Neighbors who used to lean over the fence for 20-minute conversations began waving from a distance. The Lions Club membership that Walter had held for 19 years was not formally revoked. He simply stopped being invited to the meetings, and when he showed up to one anyway, found that the meeting time had been changed without notice to anyone who might have informed him. Dorothy experienced it differently. Women of a certain social standing in a small town communicate exclusion through refinements of politeness so precise they are almost invisible. A table at the diner that had always been saved for Dorothy and her friends that was no longer saved. A book club invitation that went to everyone in the neighborhood except her. A conversation that stopped just a half beat too quickly when she walked into a room and resumed a half beat too cheerfully when the pause had been acknowledged. She cataloged these things the way she cataloged everything quietly, systematically, without complaint. But they accumulated. The Tuesday morning that changed everything for Dorothy happened in the library where she worked. She was 3 rows over in the 800s literature, reorganizing a cart of returns, moving efficiently through the familiar ritual of matching spine to slot when she heard voices from the next aisle. 2 women. She recognized both voices immediately, the way you recognize voices that have been part of your life for decades, voices you have heard across church halls and dinner tables, in the particular acoustics of small-town gatherings, where the same people occupy the same spaces year after year. One was Meredith Caulfield, who had been in Dorothy's Sunday school class for 11 years. The other was June Hartwell, whose husband had bought every bag of specialty fertilizer he'd used for a decade from Marsh Hardware. Dorothy had given June Hartwell's family Thanksgiving dinner in 2019. A full meal delivered to their door when June's husband had been between jobs and they were too proud to ask for help. Dorothy had not mentioned it since. It was not the kind of thing you mentioned. She heard Meredith say with the gentle authority of someone delivering a considered verdict, the Marshes lost everything. At their age, honestly, you'd think they would have been smarter about it. Dorothy's hand stopped moving. I heard their kids won't even step in, June replied. There was no malice in her voice that was almost worse, just the mild, curious tone of someone processing information about people who had become abstract to her. Says something, doesn't it, when your own children won't help you? A pause, the soft sound of a book being slid back onto a shelf. Well, Meredith said with a kind of satisfied finality that required no elaboration. You reap what you sow. Dorothy stood in the 800 section holding a copy of a Steinbeck novel in both hands and felt something pass through her that was not grief and not anger, but a kind of absolute clarity. The clarity of a woman who has just understood something she had been trying not to understand for a long time. The town didn't see them anymore. Not really. Not as people. They had become a cautionary tale, a lesson in what not to do, how not to age, what failure looks like when it happens to people who should have known better. And in the precise, ruthless economy of a small-town social regard, a cautionary tale has no standing. It has no chair at the table. It is pointed at briefly and then moved past. The woman who had received a Thanksgiving meal she'd been too proud to ask for had just described the woman who delivered it as someone who reaped what she sowed. Dorothy finished her cart without making a sound. She went home that evening and said nothing about it to Walter because he was already caring enough. The Sunday morning at Clarksburg Community Church came 3 weeks later. They had been attending that church for 47 years. Dorothy had taught Sunday school there for 19 of those years. Walter had served on the Buildings and Grounds Committee for 11, had helped replace the roof. In 2007, had painted the fellowship hall twice, with his own hands, in his own brushes, in his own weekends. They had buried friends from that congregation, had celebrated births and marriages in those pews, had sat in the same seats so many times that the wood had in some small way been shaped by their presence. Pastor Norris was a careful man. He had the practiced warmth of someone who had learned over years of ministry that delivering difficult messages with sufficient gentleness allowed both parties to pretend the message was something other than what it was. He was good at his work. That was in some ways the problem. He caught them after the service as the congregation gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and the particular sociability of people who see each other primarily in formal contexts and have learned to perform ease within them. He suggested in the tone of someone offering a thoughtful gift that they might speak privately. They followed him to his office, which was tastefully furnished and smelled of old books and the subtle authority of a man accustomed to being the one with answers. He spoke for several minutes about the church's current financial campaign, about the importance of projecting an image of success and vitality to attract new members, and the kind of major donors whose contributions funded meaningful programming. He spoke about how he understood their situation was difficult, how the church community wanted nothing but the best. For them, how deeply they were valued. His voice was warm throughout. His eyes were kind throughout. He was very good at this. And then he said that they might find it more comfortable, more suited to their current circumstances, to attend one of the satellite services the church ran on Thursday evenings for, as he put it, people who are working through difficult seasons. The satellite service, the one held in the basement of a converted hardware store on the south end of town. The one attended by people in recovery programs, people between housing situations, people experiencing the kinds of difficulties that the congregation's main body preferred to address philanthropically rather than adjacently. Dorothy said, "Are you asking us to leave?" The question was direct and clear and required a direct and clear answer. Pastor Norris smiled gently and looked at a point slightly above her left shoulder. "I'm asking you to consider what environment would best support you right now." He did not answer the question. He did not need to. The non-answer was the answer, and all three of them understood it with complete precision. Walter stood up. He buttoned his jacket, the good one, the dark wool he'd owned for 15 years, well-maintained, the kind of garment that requires attention to keep presentable and that rewards that attention by lasting, and he extended his hand to Pastor Norris, who shook it. "Thank you for the coffee," Walter said. They walked out through the fellowship hall, past the people who had known them for nearly 5 decades, past the coffee urn and the folding tables and the photographs of church history mounted on the walls, some of which included their own faces, younger faces, faces that belonged to people who had been useful and contributing and therefore visible, and out into the gray October morning. They did not go back. That evening, Dorothy set a folder on the kitchen table between them. Walter looked at it. He recognized it, had seen it before, filed it away in the back of a drawer, where things go when you intend to deal with them someday under better circumstances. Inside was the documentation for a property Walter's Uncle Clarence had left him 11 years ago. A cabin in the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachian Mountains, 6 hours southwest of Clarksburg, in a part of Virginia where the roads became suggestions and the cell service became a rumor. Clarence had lived there alone for the last decade of his life, after the world, in its efficient and impersonal way, had decided it was finished with him. No one in the family had visited him there. Not Walter, not his father, who was Clarence's younger brother, not any of them. When Clarence died, the cabin passed to Walter in a will that the family had found eccentric. Eccentric was the word they used. What they meant was inconvenient, because an inconvenient piece of remote mountain property required decisions, and decisions required attention, and attention was always in short supply. They had planned to sell it. The market for remote Appalachian cabins in that part of the mountains was soft in ways that made the real estate agents sound apologetic. The property taxes were low enough to manage. And so it had sat there, empty, waiting, accumulating 11 years of silence while life went on around them, and then went sideways, and then finally stopped looking like the life they had planned. "There," Dorothy said, simply, without drama or elaboration, the way she said most things that actually mattered. Walter looked at the papers for a long time. The cabin was described in the county records as rustic, which is real estate language for a category of condition that precedes habitable. In the one photograph they had faded, taken in the late 90s, the colors gone soft and approximate, it had appeared to be roughly 800 square feet set in a clearing of mature pines, with a stone chimney at one end and a hand pump standing beside the front steps like a sentinel from another era. "We don't know what condition it's in," he said. "We know what condition we're in here," she said. "Walter, we are disappearing, not dying disappearing. While people watch and find us instructive, while people who ate our food and used our store and sat in our Sunday school class decide that losing a business at 76 means we were never worth anything at all." He looked at his wife of 52 years, at her white hair and her scratched reading glasses and her hands, which had made tens of thousands of meals and reshelved 10,000 library books and raised 3 children and built a business alongside him shoulder to shoulder for 4 decades, and held his hand through everything that business had eventually cost them. He looked at those hands for a long moment. "It'll be cold up there," he said. "The winters at that elevation are serious. We're not young." "No," she said, "we're not, but we're not finished either. I refuse to believe we are finished." He sat with that for a while. The apartment on Belden Street was quiet around them, the thin walls admitting the sound of a television from next door, the distant rhythm of traffic on the main road, the particular compressed quiet of a life that had contracted to fit a smaller space and was still in the process of contracting. Every week, the space felt a little smaller. Every week, the silence that followed them felt a little heavier. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Together, he said, always together. Always, she said. She turned her hand over and held his. They told no one. There was no announcement, no farewell gathering, no ceremony of departure. The children would be informed, but not tonight, and not by phone that would come later from the road, in a text message that was brief and certain and did not invite negotiation. We've moved. We're fine. We need some time. They had discussed this and both understood that any advance notice would produce a cascade of concern and argument and logistical intervention that would either delay or prevent the decision entirely. The decision had been made. The making of it had been the hardest part. They were not going to unmake it through discussion. They spent the rest of Sunday night packing. It didn't take long, and that itself was a kind of accounting 52 years of a life in its current reduced form, fitting into the bed of Walter's truck with room to spare. Clothes carefully chosen for utility and warmth. Books because Dorothy would not leave without books, and Walter did not suggest she should. The photograph albums, which were not negotiable. A serious box of tools that Walter had assembled with the deliberate forethought of a man planning for specific problems. The folder with the cabin's paperwork and Clarence's hand-drawn map of the access route. Dorothy's small kit of dried herbs and the reference book she'd been slowly building margin notes in since she'd found it at a library sale 2 years ago. Walter's good wool jacket and his worn leather work gloves. They left at 4:45 on Monday morning before the sky had begun to lighten. Walter carried the apartment key down to the building manager's mailbox with a note and the final month's rent, which they had set aside specifically for this moment, weeks before they had fully admitted to themselves that this moment was coming. Dorothy sat in the truck with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the dark windows of the building. They were leaving at the other lives sleeping behind those windows, at the particular darkness of a place you are leaving and will not return to. She felt something she had not expected to feel. Relief. Not happiness that was different and would come later, or perhaps not come at all, and she was old enough not to require its guarantee. But the clean groundwater clarity of relief, the relief of a decision made after too long a period of indecision, the relief of motion beginning after a very long and costly stillness. Walter climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out of the Belden Street parking lot without looking in the rearview mirror. Behind them, Clarksburg went on sleeping. And 3 blocks away, in a downtown office building, the newly signed contract for the purchase of the building at 4th and Carpenter sat in a filing cabinet in Conrad Hale's office, waiting for morning. Conrad would hold his press conference at 11. He would stand at a podium and speak about revitalization, about vision, about opportunity, about what Clarksburg could become in the hands of people with the energy and capital to move it forward. He would use the word future several times. He would use the word potential more times than that. He would not mention the people who had built the building. He would not mention the 40 years of work and had worn the threshold smooth, the thousands of customers who had come through its door, the 2 people who had spent the better part of their lives behind its counter. He would not mention them because it would not occur to him that they warranted mentioning. They had been an obstacle that had conveniently resolved itself. The road stretched out ahead of Walter and Dorothy Marsh in the darkness through the hills of West Virginia, the highway giving way to state routes and the state routes giving way to county roads, climbing steadily toward the mountains, toward the cabin that had been waiting for 11 years, toward the unknown shape of whatever came next. Walter reached over and turned on the heater. Dorothy opened her book. They drove. The road ended before the cabin did. What had been pavement gave way to gravel, midway past the 3rd County line marker, and gravel gave way to packed dirt, and packed dirt gave way to 2 tire tracks pressed into the earth by vehicles that hadn't passed this way in years. The tracks were barely visible under the encroachment of grass and low scrub brush that had taken the opportunity of an uncontested road to make its own claims. Walter drove slowly, the truck rocking through ruts and washouts, branches scraping the sides with a sound like something testing the perimeter. Dorothy held the folder of papers in her lap and tracked their progress against the hand-drawn map tucked inside it, drawn by Clarence himself years ago, in the precise small handwriting of a man who had lived alone long enough to become very deliberate about the things he committed to paper. Every landmark was noted, every turn was marked. The map had the quality of something made by someone who expected it to be used by someone who had never been here because he had always known that was how it would go. Bear left at the split oak, she said. I see it. Then another quarter mile, then a right where the trail forks at the creek crossing. Walter said nothing. He was watching the track, watching the trees, watching the way the light came through the canopy and broken columns that shifted as the truck moved beneath them. The forest up here was old growth and second growth, mixed together in the way mountain forests are thick-trunked, maples and oaks at the lower elevations, giving way to pines as they climbed the air, coming through the cracked window, carrying something he didn't have a name for immediately. Something that hadn't been processed or filtered or moved through the accumulated infrastructure of a town. Something that tasted of elevation and distance. Something clean. The cabin appeared between the trees without announcement. Walter stopped the truck and left the engine running, and they sat and looked at it through the windshield for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. The situation seemed to require a pause before either of them said something that would make it real. It was smaller than the photograph had suggested, or perhaps the photograph had been taken from an angle that flattered its proportions. The structure sat in a clearing that had been gradually reclaimed by the forest over 12 years of human absence. Young birch trees coming in at the edges, tall grass pressed flat in sections by the weight of the winter just past. The roof sagged on the left side with the particular patience of something that has been sagging slowly for a long time and has not yet decided whether to continue. The porch steps had lost their railing entirely. The windows were intact but opaque with the accumulated grime of a decade of weather and seasons. The stone chimney at the east end had developed a lean that was noticeable but not Walter judged with the eye of a man who had assessed structural problems for 40 years critical. The hand pump beside the front steps was still standing. He turned off the engine. "Well," Dorothy said. "Yeah," Walter said. They climbed out. The silence of the clearing reached them before anything else did. Not the managed quiet of a neighborhood at 3 in the morning, where silence is really just the pause between the ordinary noises of occupied life. This was a different quality of silence, entirely layered and inhabited, full of the sounds that silence is actually made of when you get far enough from everything else. Wind in the high pines moving through them in long, unhurried waves. The distant, constant conversation of a creek somewhere below the property. A woodpecker working methodically at a dead oak somewhere to the north, the sound carrying clean and sharp through the cold air. The particular resonance of a space that has not been compressed by traffic construction, electrical infrastructure, or the background hum of 10,000 machines all running simultaneously. Walter stood in the clearing and felt something in his chest that he didn't immediately recognize. It took him a moment to identify it. He had not felt it in so long that it had lost its name for him. It was the absence of being watched. For 11 months in Clarksburg, he had moved through every space with the persistent, low-grade awareness of a man who knows he is being observed and evaluated and found wanting. At Home Base Depot, where Derek Paulson's eyes tracked him like a problem waiting to be documented. At the grocery store, where he could feel former customers calculating the distance they needed to put between themselves and the failure he represented. At the gas station, at the diner, at the Lions Club meeting, where the time had been changed without telling him, always that background frequency of other people's judgment tuned just below the threshold of direct confrontation, but present in every room on every block, in every conversation that went a half beat too short. Here there was nothing. The trees had no opinion about Marsh hardware and supply. The creek had no interest in what he had lost. The woodpecker was entirely indifferent to the question of whether Walter Marsh had been a success or a failure, or something the town found it more convenient to classify as a cautionary tale. He reached back into the truck bed and pulled out the first box. "Let's see what we have," he said. The cabin door had swollen in its frame from years of moisture moving through the wood, expanding in wet seasons, contracting in dry ones, until the door and the frame had developed their own particular argument about where their shared boundary actually was. Walter had to put his shoulder into it twice before it gave, and when it did, the smell came out first. 12 years of closed space, dust and old wood, and the faint organic residue of something that had lived in the walls at some point and no longer did. The specific staleness of a place that has been waiting in the dark for someone to come back and restore it to its purpose. He stepped inside and let his eyes adjust. One main room roughly 30 feet by 20. A pot-bellied stove against the north wall cast iron, old enough to belong to an earlier era of American self-sufficiency, connected to the chimney by a length of stovepipe that had developed a coating of surface rust on the exterior, but appeared when Walter leaned close and looked with the attention of a man who had spent decades assessing such things to be sound where it mattered. A kitchen area along the east wall, a counter worn smooth by use of dry sink shelving that had bowed slightly in the middle under the weight of nothing in particular for a decade. A doorway leading to a sleeping area behind a curtain that had faded from what might have been a dark blue to a color that the light no longer had any precise claim on. A table, two chairs, both solid, made from local hardwood by someone who understood joinery as a craft rather than a process, though the finish had worn away to bare wood over the years. And covering all of it, every surface, every corner, every horizontal plane, a layer of dust thick enough to write your name in, threaded through with mouse droppings and the papery remnants of old spider webs, in the general evidence of 12 years of undisturbed occupation by everything except people. Dorothy came in behind him and stood at his shoulder, taking it in. "It's structurally sound," Walter said. "I can see that. The stove will need cleaning before we light it. The flue pipe needs to be checked end to end. Yes. The pump outside, I want to prime it and check the seal before we rely on it for water." "Walter," Dorothy said. He looked at her. "We've done harder things than this." She said it simply as a statement of documented fact. "We built the store from a rented room on Mill Street. We raised 3 children on what a hardware store makes in a small town. We've done harder things." He thought about that. He thought about the rented space on Mill Street and the year they'd run it on almost nothing while the children were small, eating sandwiches for dinner and calling it a choice rather than a necessity because it was more useful to call it a choice. He thought about all the things he and this woman had faced without a map, without a guarantee, without anyone telling them it would work out, and about the fact that after 52 years they were still standing in the same room. "Get the brooms," he said. She smiled, not a large smile, but the real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere that hasn't been performance or effort, and went back to the truck. They worked for 3 days before they stopped to rest properly. Walter took the stove first because the stove was the foundation of everything else. No stove, no warmth, and no warmth in these mountains in late October meant no survival. He cleaned the firebox down to bare metal, checked the damper mechanism, tested the draw by lighting a small fire of dry leaves collected from the clearing and watching the smoke move as it should, up and out without hesitation. It drew well. The stovepipe surface, rusted on the outside, was clean enough inside to function safely once he'd run a brush through its length. He inspected every joint and found them sound. He spent an afternoon on the roof. The sag on the left side was, as he had assessed from the ground, a matter of one rotted support board rather than a systemic failure, manageable, specific, the kind of problem a man can actually solve. He replaced the board with lumber he had brought in the truck specifically for this purpose because Walter Marsh had spent 40 years anticipating what a job would require before he arrived at it, and that particular habit of mind had survived everything else intact. Dorothy took the interior with the same systematic approach she brought to everything that required organization rather than improvisation. She worked from ceiling to floor, dust first, then surfaces, then floors, the logical sequence of someone who doesn't want to clean the same thing twice. She found a mouse entry point behind the dry sink, a gap where a piece of old flashing had pulled away from the foundation skirt and packed it with steel wool, in a section of new flashing she cut from material in Walter's supply box. She assessed the curtain rod in the sleeping area, found it sound, and replaced the ruined curtain with a folded wool blanket from their supplies that served the purpose better than the original had in its last years. She determined that the bed frame was solid Appalachian hardwood that had decades left in it and only needed new rope woven through the frame rails to support weight properly. On the second day, she found the book. It was on the lowest shelf of the kitchen area, wedged behind what had been a row of canned goods that were long past any practical use, their labels faded to illegibility. A hand-bound volume roughly but durably assembled its cover, made from stiffened cardboard wrapped in cloth that had once been a heavier fabric, now soft with age. Someone had written on the front cover, in the small, precise handwriting she recognized from the hand-drawn map, "Useful plants of the Southern Appalachians," with notes. She opened it carefully the way you open something old that has been waiting to be opened. The pages were dense with information, hand-printed descriptions in the same careful script as the map and the cover. Small detailed drawings of plants with their identifying features labeled, and notes crowded into the margins that appeared to have been added across years. Observations layered over observations as the knowledge deepened, and the seasons taught things that a first reading couldn't have anticipated. Elderberry preparations for fever. Pine needle tea rich in vitamin C for respiratory illness during the months when nothing fresh was available. Plantain leaf for wound treatment. Wild ginger for nausea and digestive distress. Thyme steep bed for its properties against infection. Yarrow for its uses in the field when nothing else was at hand. The notes were detailed, practical, and entirely unsentimental, compiled by a man who had understood that living alone far from medical help was not a romantic condition, but a logistical one, and had addressed it accordingly. Dorothy sat in the one good chair for 2 hours and read it from the beginning, making her own notes on a small pad she kept in her bag. On the afternoon of the third day, Walter went to check the hand pump. He primed it the way he'd seen it done 40 years ago, pouring a small measure from one of their stored water bottles down the pipe to seat the leather seal. He worked the handle stiffly, at first the mechanism protesting the decades of disuse in its joints, and then with increasing freedom as the components remembered their purpose. And then there was a sound from somewhere far below the surface of the ground, a deep hydraulic gathering, a pressure building through the column of pipe, and then the water came. Cold. Genuinely cold in the way that only groundwater is cold, carrying the temperature of the deep earth. Clear in the way that only water untouched by municipal processing is clear. Moving from somewhere that had nothing to do with treatment facilities or distribution infrastructure, or the systems that require payment and permission, in the participation of a larger structure to operate. Just water from the earth, from a spring that had been sending water to the surface of this clearing since long before anyone had thought to sink a pipe to meet it. Walter cupped his hands under the flow and drank. He stood there alone in the clearing, with cold water from the ground on his hands and the pines moving overhead in the October wind, and no name tag pinned to his chest, and felt something so unfamiliar that it took him several seconds to identify it correctly. He felt like himself, not the self that had worn the blue vest for 8 months and thanked Derek Paulson for reminders about inventory systems. Not the self that had sat across from Pastor Norris and shaken his hand and said thank you for the coffee, while 47 years of contribution to that congregation dissolved politely and tidily around him. Not the self that had walked through Clarksburg carrying the particular weight of a man who has been reclassified by the community that once built its regard around him into a cautionary tale. The self who knew how to build things. The self who knew how to fix things. The self who had looked at problems, real problems, physical problems, problems with weight and dimension and specific solutions, and understood in his hands before he understood in his mind what each one required. That self was still present. He had wondered in the worst weeks in Clarksburg whether it was. He went inside and told Dorothy the pump worked. It was on the 4th day while replacing a rotted section of the east interior wall that Walter found the box. He had pulled the damaged boards away to inspect the studs behind them, standard practice for a man who knows that wood rot is rarely an isolated condition, that it travels along moisture paths and through adjacent material, and that the visible damage is usually not the full extent of the problem. The studs were sound, but there wedged between two of them at approximately shoulder height was a tobacco tin. Old, the kind that had been common in the 40s and 50s, when tobacco came in flat rectangular tins that were sturdy enough to be repurposed for keeping small things safe. The red and gold of its label had mostly gone. The metal surface was dimpled with age but had not rusted through, and it had been placed there with deliberate care positioned so that it would not shift. Walter stood on the ladder and held it for a long moment before he climbed down. Dorothy was at the table working through their supply inventory with the methodical attention she gave to anything that required accurate accounting. She looked up when he came in carrying the tin. "What is that?" "Found it in the wall, between the studs." He sat down across from her and worked the lid open carefully with a flathead screwdriver, prying at the seal that age had tightened. Inside, folded twice with the precision of someone who wanted it to keep indefinitely, was a piece of paper. He unfolded it with care. The paper was dry, preserved by the tin in the wall around it in the particular stable conditions of a space that had been sealed and left alone. The handwriting was the same small, deliberate script he had come to recognize. Clarence's handwriting. The handwriting of a man who had been Walter's father's older brother, born in 1931, who had worked the mines for 20 years, and the county road crew for 10 more, and then at 68 had driven up into these mountains and stayed until he couldn't anymore. The man whose body had been found by a county ranger doing a routine check. The man none of them had visited. Walter read it silently first all the way through. Then Dorothy said, "Read it to me." He read it aloud slowly, giving each sentence the space it had been waiting to occupy. "I came here because the world decided I was finished. I didn't agree. I wanted to prove at least to myself that a man the world is done with is not necessarily done with himself. I think I proved it. 11 years up here, and I have not once regretted coming only arriving so late. Whoever finds this, don't wait as long as I did. The world will always have reasons for you to stay and diminish quietly. It takes something to leave, but it takes more to stay somewhere that has stopped valuing you and call that dignity. That's not dignity. I know now what dignity actually feels like. It feels like this. Whatever this is for you, find it. Don't wait." Walter set the paper on the table. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in the slow, rhythmic way of wind that has no destination. The creek ran where it ran, doing what water does when left to its own purposes. A hawk turned slow circles in the column of sky visible through the clearing above them, reading the thermals with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry. "He was alone," Dorothy said finally, quietly, carefully. Not as accusation, she had not gone to see him either, and she knew it, and Walter knew she knew it, as a fact that needed to be acknowledged before it could be set down properly. "He was alone," Walter agreed. "We're not." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held it. They left the letter on the table where they could see it. It stayed there through all the weeks that followed, and Walter read it every few days the way you read something that says what you need to keep hearing in order to keep believing it. By the end of the first month, something had shifted in both of them that was difficult to name, but impossible to miss. Walter's blood pressure, which had been running at levels his doctor in Clarksburg had characterized as a serious concern requiring medication he'd been taking for 3 years, had dropped measurably. He checked it weekly with the cuff he'd brought, applying the same methodical attention to his own health that he applied to everything else. The numbers kept coming down. He said nothing about it to Dorothy, but she noticed that he was sleeping through the night, which he had not done in 2 years, and that the particular set of his jaw that she had come to associate with sustained stress had eased in ways she hadn't seen since before the store began its decline. Dorothy's arthritis, the chronic inflammation that had been worsening steadily through the final years of the store, and the months that followed, settled into something more manageable. Her hands still ached in the cold mornings. That was not something the mountains could cure, but by midday they moved freely, and she was using them in ways that the library work had never required. Real work, physical work, work that left evidence of itself at the end of the day. They fell into rhythms that felt old and right, as though they were recovering something they had set down a long time ago and had been half aware of missing ever since. Walter split wood in the mornings when the air was cool and his back was at its most cooperative. He had built a proper firewood rack along the south side of the cabin roof, pitched to shed rain solidly anchored, dimensioned to hold a serious quantity of split wood, and he added to it steadily, thinking forward to winter, with the instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime planning in seasons. He checked the snares he'd set along the creek, simple wire snares positioned at the places where the animal trails narrowed. Learning the patterns of the property and its inhabitants, the way you learn any system through observation and patience, and the willingness to adjust based on what the evidence actually shows. He repaired the cabin continuously because there was always something, a shutter that needed rehinging, a section of porch floor that had gone soft and needed replacement, a gap in the foundation skirt that needed packing against the cold that was coming. Dorothy's garden was modest. The season was already past its prime planting window by the time they arrived, but she had found a south-facing patch of ground with good light exposure and reasonable soil, and she put in what she could, a late crop of green beans, some squash kale that would last well into the cold, several rows of root vegetables that would hold in storage through the winter. She worked through Clarence's plant book with the focused attention she had brought to every subject she'd ever wanted to understand deeply, identifying what grew wild on the property, learning its applications, building a small but serious store of dried materials in the kitchen that she organized and labeled with the same system she would have used in a library. They talked more than they had in years. Not the compressed operational conversation of two people managing a failing business. Did you reach the supplier? What did the accountant say? Is there anything we can move to cover the payment? But the longer, slower kind of conversation that requires time and the absence of urgency. About the store, not with the raw grief of people still inside the loss, but with the more considered honest knowledge of people finally far enough from it to see its actual shape. About the children where things had gone sideways with each of them, and when and why and what part of it had been their own doing, and what part had simply been the natural divergence of separate lives developing in separate directions. About what they wished they had done differently and what they were entirely glad they had done exactly as they had with no revision. About what they wanted for however much time remained. This was a conversation they had never quite allowed themselves before. It had always felt presumptuous or premature or like a distraction from the more immediate concerns. Here it felt necessary. It felt like the most important conversation available. One evening in the 6th week, sitting on the repaired porch in the last of the October light, Dorothy said, "I didn't know I was unhappy in Clarksburg. Not while I was there. Not until I got here and felt what the other thing is like." What other thing? Being somewhere that doesn't require you to apologize for existing. She paused. I didn't know I was doing that. Apologizing, not with words, but with the way I moved through rooms, with how much space I tried not to take up. Walter considered the mountains going dark in front of them, the tree line turning from deep green to black against the orange and purple of the sky. He thought about the fastener aisle and the blue vest and Derek Paulson's tablet. He thought about the walk through the fellowship hall past the photographs. We should have left years ago, he said. We weren't ready to leave years ago, she said. We needed them to push us. We needed it to become undeniable before we could choose something else. She looked at him. I'm not sorry it happened the way it did. I'm only sorry it took so long. October brought the first true cold down from the high ridges, and with it a visitor. Walter was checking the north snare line moving through the trees with the quiet ease he'd developed over 2 months of daily walking on this property, learning its particular geography the way you learn a face through repeated exposure until recognition becomes automatic. He heard footsteps on the trail before he saw anyone. Not animal footsteps. Human ones, deliberate and weighted with the particular fatigue of someone who had been covering serious miles with serious weight on their back for weeks. He waited standing still in the trees the way he had learned to stand still. The man who came around the bend was in his early 60s, lean in the way that sustained trail walking makes a person lean, his face weathered, with the particular combination of sun and wind that accumulates on a face that has been outside for weeks at a stretch. He carried a large pack with the practiced ease of someone who had made their peace with its weight, and he stopped when he saw Walter in the trees with the alert but unalarmed assessment of someone accustomed to being alone in the backcountry. Didn't expect to see anyone up here, the man said. We live here, Walter said, stepping out of the trees. We. The man looked toward the cabin, visible as a suggestion through the pines. Year-round, planning on it. The man introduced himself as Everett Dawes, retired teacher out of Morgantown. He had been hiking the trail system for 3 weeks, sleeping in his tent, covering the miles because the miles needed covering and his body needed the work. And the alternative was an empty house in a city where everything reminded him of what was missing. His wife of 43 years had died in March. Her name was Patricia. He didn't say more than that, and Walter didn't ask because some losses announced their full dimensions without being prompted. They walked back to the cabin together. Dorothy made coffee on the stove. She had become expert in the stove's particular requirements, in the precise relationship between the damper position and the air intake, and the quality of the fire it produced, and they sat at the table and talked for 2 hours. It was the first real conversation with anyone from the outside world since they had left Clarksburg, and Walter was struck by the quality of it. There was no social calculus operating beneath the surface, no assessment of what each party stood to gain or lose from the interaction, no careful calibration of what to say based on how it might affect one's standing or reputation. Just two men at a rough wooden table in the mountains talking about things that had weight. Toward the end of the second cup, Everett said something that landed differently than the rest. "I heard about you two," he said. "Before I came up here, I grew up in the county, still have family in Clarksburg. My cousin lives 2 streets from where your store used to be." Walter looked at him steadily and without hurry. "What do they say?" Everett set his cup down on the table with the deliberate care of a man who is about to say something he thinks the other person needs to hear and is making sure he has the other person's full attention before he says it. "They're saying you won't last the winter. That's the working consensus from what my cousin tells me. The general expectation is that you'll be back in Clarksburg before Christmas, circumstances having proved too much." Everett paused. "Conrad Hale, the man who bought your building, told his real estate broker that you'd be calling to sell the cabin by November. He's apparently been making inquiries about the property. Believes he'll be able to acquire it at a favorable price once the situation becomes untenable." Those were the words my cousin heard secondhand. "When you come back with your tail between your legs." That's his phrase, apparently. The kitchen was quiet. Dorothy's hands were still around her coffee cup, not moving. Walter looked out the window at the firewood rack, which was more than half full now and growing. He looked at the rows of herb bundles Dorothy had hung from the ceiling, joists to dry the careful labeled order of them. He looked at Clarence's letter on the table, which he had read enough times now that he knew it without looking at it, but looked at it anyway. He thought about Conrad Hale in his downtown office with the press conference and the word revitalization, and the filing cabinet with the contract at 60% of actual value. He thought about the firewood he still needed to split. "Then I guess," Walter said with the quiet certainty of a man who has already decided, "we'd better make sure the firewood lasts till April." A small smile crossed Dorothy's face. She took a sip of her coffee. Everett Dawes left the next morning, continuing south on the trail. Before he went, he shook Walter's hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake strictly requires, the way men do when something has passed between them that they're not going to name. "I'll come back in the spring," he said. "Check on you." "We'll be here," Walter said. November came in hard. December came in harder. The first significant snow fell on the 8th of November, 14 inches overnight, arriving with the silent efficiency of serious mountain weather and more in the forecast behind it. Walter had finished the primary firewood rack, by then filled it to capacity, and built a secondary storage pile under a heavy canvas tarp along the cabin's west wall, anchored against the wind. Their food stores were serious and carefully inventoried, smoked and dried meat from the rabbits Walter had taken through the fall, using methods he had read about, and then practiced until the results met his standards. Dorothy's root vegetables in the root cellar Walter had dug beneath the sleeping area floor, insulated and accessible through a trap door. Preserved goods in jars on the kitchen shelving, organized by Dorothy with the labeling precision of a librarian. Dry staples portioned into containers with dates and quantities noted. They were not unprepared. But a mountain winter at this elevation does not negotiate with preparation. It only acknowledges preparation briefly before presenting the next thing. January was the worst month of Walter Marsh's life. It did not begin that way. The early weeks were merely demanding, the cadence requiring constant and careful management, the wood consumption running slightly higher than his calculations had anticipated because he had underestimated the heat loss through the east wall before he'd fully insulated it. Dorothy's arthritis was more difficult in the deep cold, making the mornings slow. They moved through the days with the careful economy of people who have understood that everything up here costs something real and nothing can be wasted. Then in the third week of January, Walter began to cough. He recognized almost immediately that it was something more than the dry air irritation he'd been managing since November. It came from deeper in his chest, with a heaviness and a persistence that a simple dry air cough does not have. By the second day, his chest had begun to tighten in a way that concerned him more than he showed Dorothy, because there was nothing to be gained from concerning her before he understood the extent of it himself. By the third day, he could not maintain his temperature below 101 even, with the fire kept high and himself kept warm. And by the fourth day, when Dorothy pressed her hand to his forehead in the gray early light of the mountain morning, the thermometer read 104. He could not stand without her assistance. They were 8 miles from the nearest county road. The access track to the cabin was buried under 3 feet of compacted snow, impassable without equipment neither of them had. There was no cellular signal. There had never been cellular signal on the property which they had known and accepted. The satellite emergency communicator they had brought as a precaution, a small device designed to send distress signals regardless of cellular coverage, had failed during a temperature drop. 2 weeks earlier, the battery unable to hold charge in the sustained cold. Walter had noted this and set it aside and had not yet addressed the problem of replacing or repairing it. He had not addressed it because he had been healthy and the winter had been going well, and he had made the mistake of assuming that the absence of an immediate crisis meant the preparation could wait. Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her husband. His breathing was labored. Not yet at the level that signals imminent collapse, but labored in the particular way that says the body is working very hard to manage something. It is not certain that it can manage the kind of breathing that a person who has been paying attention to the people she loves learns to distinguish from ordinary respiratory illness. His color was wrong. His hands, when she held them to check them, were dry and much too warm, the skin pulling against her fingers in the way of significant dehydration accompanying high fever. She was 74 years old. She was alone in a mountain cabin in a West Virginia January with a sick husband and no way to call for help. The nearest hospital was in current conditions, not a distance measured in miles, but a distance measured in impossibility. She sat with this for a moment, not in panic because panic uses resources that she needed for other things, and thought through it clearly. Her options were two. She could take the emergency kit dress in every layer available to her and walk 8 miles through compacted mountain snow in temperatures that had not risen above 10 degrees in a week to reach the county road, where she would need to flag down a vehicle if any vehicles were traveling that road in these conditions, and somehow direct emergency services back up a track that did not appear on standard maps. At her age, with her arthritis in those conditions, the walk would take between 4 and 6 hours. She might not reach the road. And in the hours she was gone, Walter would be alone with a fever climbing toward dangerous, with no one to manage the fire or give him fluids or monitor his breathing. Or she could stay. She went to the kitchen shelf and took down Clarence's herb book. She had been reading it since August. She had tested its preparations carefully and methodically through the fall, using small quantities to understand their effects before she might need them under conditions that did not allow for experimentation. She had built her supply of dried materials specifically because she was a woman who planned for contingencies she hoped would never arrive. Pine needle tea, rich in vitamin C, and effective against respiratory illness. She had pine needles dried and stored. Elderberry preparation for fever management. She had made 2 batches in November and jarred them. Wild ginger for the nausea that was beginning to accompany his fever. Thyme steeped in near boiling water for its documented properties against pulmonary infection. She had thyme from her garden, dried and labeled enough for weeks. She built the fire up to the maximum safe capacity of the stove and kept it there, managing it through the night with the attention of someone who understood that the fire was not a comfort, but a clinical necessity. She set her internal alarm for every 2 hours and slept in the chair beside the bed, waking to check his temperature, to give him fluids she warmed on the stove, because cold water would cost his body heat to process, to replace the cloth on his forehead, to listen with focused attention to the quality of his breathing in the dark. The first night was the longest night of her life. Not in duration, it was an ordinary January night in the mountains, 14 hours of darkness, but in the quality of attention it required the sustained vigilance of someone who is the only safeguard between a person she loves and something serious. The second night his temperature reached 105 at 3 in the morning. Dorothy sat beside him in the dark cabin, the fire ticking, the wind working at the windows, the mountains outside indifferent and enormous, with her hand resting on his chest, feeling his heartbeat, and made a private and complete agreement with herself. She would not leave this room. She would not leave this room because there was nowhere she could go that would be more useful than here, and because she had not lived 52 years alongside this man, to leave him in a mountain cabin alone at 3 in the morning with 105 fever. She gave him elderberry and pine needle tea through the night, warm in small measures, that she could get him to take even in his half-conscious state. She kept the cloth cold and kept replacing it. She kept the fire exactly where it needed to be. The third night the fever broke. She knew it before she checked the thermometer, the way you know things about a person's body after 52 years of proximity to it. The quality of his sleep changed, deepened, smoothed, lost the shallow, restless quality of a body fighting hard. The skin under her hands shifted from the dry, papery heat of serious fever to something moister and less desperate, the kind of warmth that belongs to a body that has stopped fighting quite so hard because the worst is passing. She checked the thermometer at 5 in the morning, 101, and falling. She sat back in the chair. She covered her face with both hands. She breathed slowly and deliberately for the first time in 3 days without calibrating each breath against the sound of his. By the fourth morning, Walter opened his eyes in the pale gray light that came through the east window and looked at the familiar ceiling of the cabin for a moment, orienting himself to where he was and what had happened. Then he turned his head. Dorothy was in the chair. She had been in the chair. She looked, he thought, with the accuracy of a man who has known this woman's face in every possible version of itself, like someone who has been through something they will not talk about for a while yet, compressed, translucent, emptied of everything except the core of whatever she is made of at the deepest level, which is, he had known for 52 years considerable. How long, he said. His voice was rough, his chest still tender, but his mind was entirely clear. 4 days, Dorothy said. He looked at her for a long time. He read her face the way he had learned to read it, the way you learn to read anything you have paid close attention to for decades, through the surface to the structure underneath. What he saw was a woman who had spent 4 days keeping him alive with nothing except her knowledge, her preparation, her hands, and her absolute refusal to leave. You stayed, he said. Where would I go? She said. Not a question. He reached out his hand. She reached back and took it without getting up, without moving from the chair she had occupied for 4 days. We saved each other, he said, like we've been doing for 52 years. 53, she said. Our anniversary was last month. He looked at her. I forgot. You had a fever of 105. Still. Walter. She squeezed his hand once firmly with the grip of someone who has more strength than she looks like she has. We have time. Outside, the January wind continued its work in the pines, moving through them with the patient, purposeless force of weather that has no agenda beyond its own nature. The fire in the pot-bellied stove ticked and breathed in the rhythm it had kept for months now, as reliable as anything in their lives. Somewhere beneath 3 feet of compacted snow, the creek was still running. They could hear it faintly if the wind paused long enough, and they were quiet enough. They were quiet enough. Walter lay in the warmth of the cabin, his wife's hand in his, and looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully and felt the particular gratitude of a man who has been very close to the edge of something and has come back from it to find the essential things still intact. The essential things still there. And the winter continued outside, indifferent and enormous and entirely unconcerned with what had just happened inside these walls, because the winter had always been this way and would continue to be this way long after they were gone. But they were not gone. They were here in the warmth they had built and maintained and defended together, and that was enough. That was it, turned out more than enough. March came to the Blue Ridge the way it always does in the southern Appalachians, not cleanly, not with any announcement or ceremony, but through a slow and unglamorous negotiation between winter and the thing that comes after it. A negotiation that winter appears to be losing for weeks before it finally concedes. The snow did not melt so much as it surrendered. First at the edges of the clearing along the south-facing slopes where the sun reached longest, and the ground had stored enough residual warmth through the previous seasons to push back against even January's sustained assault. Then in the clearing itself, pulling back from the cabin's foundation, revealing the dark soil beneath. Icicles formed on the porch eave in the morning cold and dripped through the warmth of the afternoon and refroze at night, and then one morning Walter woke before light and lay in the quiet and heard something he had not heard in 4 months. The creek. Running free and full, no longer compressed under ice, speaking at its full volume through the trees, to the south the sound carrying through the cold morning air, with the particular clarity that water has when everything around it is still. He lay still and listened to it for a moment. Then he got up, dressed carefully in the deliberate way his body required now in the mornings, and went outside. The clearing was transformed in the way that mountain clearings are transformed by the first real loosening of winter. Not yet lush, not yet green. Spring at this elevation, being still 6 weeks away from showing itself in leaves. But the particular gray-white compression that had settled over everything since November had lifted and the world had recovered its depth and its dimensions. The mountains visible to the south showed their ridgelines against the sky that was genuinely blue rather than the flat pewter that had been the ceiling for months. A pair of red-tailed hawks turned slow circles above the clearing, reading the thermals that came off the warming ground with the easy competence of creatures built exactly for this. Walter stood on the porch in his work boots and his good wool jacket and felt the thin March sun on his face and understood something with the whole of his body, not just his mind, not just the logical conclusion of the evidence, but in his chest, in his hands, and the particular quality of his breathing. They had made it. Not only survived the winter, though, that was not a small thing, and he would not diminish it by treating it as ordinary. Not only kept the fire and the food and the roof and the water functioning through the ice and wind and the weeks of cold that had settled into the cabin's bones like a long, unresolvable argument. They had made it through the night Dorothy had kept vigil beside him for 4 days without leaving. They had made it through the morning he had opened his eyes and found her there and understood what that had cost her. They had made it through everything Clarksburg had decided about the end of Walter Marsh and had demonstrated in the most direct possible way that Clarksburg had been wrong. He went back inside and made coffee on the stove whose rhythms and requirements he now understood as thoroughly as he had ever understood any piece of equipment in 40 years of running a hardware store. Dorothy was already at the table with Clarence's herb book open in front of her, making notes in the margins with the small, careful handwriting she used for things she wanted to find again. She looked up when he set the coffee cup beside her. "The creek's running," he said. "I heard it," she said. "First time I've heard it clearly since November." "Spring," he said. "Something like it." She looked at him over her reading glasses with the particular attention she reserved for assessments she wanted to get right. "How's your chest?" "Fine," he said. This was true. The cough had cleared entirely through February, leaving a residual tenderness that had itself resolved by the month's end. His blood pressure checked last week had been the best reading he'd recorded since before the store began its decline, better than it had been when he was taking medication for it in Clarksburg. Better than fine, actually. She nodded, made her note, and returned to her reading. He sat across from her with his coffee and the morning coming through the east window and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has stopped spending energy waiting for something to go wrong. Everett Dawes came back in the last week of March, as he had promised he would. Walter heard the truck before he saw it, the sound of an engine working carefully up the access track. Unfamiliar after months in which the only sounds from that direction had been wind and the occasional distant report of a tree cracking in the cold. He went to the porch and watched a battered green pickup navigate the soft places in the track, where the frost was still coming out of the ground in the warming days. Everett climbed out and stood in the clearing and looked at them. Walter on the porch, Dorothy coming around the corner of the cabin from the garden area where she had been on her knees in the returning earth, sketching out the season's planting plan in the dirt with a stick. "Well," Everett said. He said it the way a man says something when the situation in front of him is considerably better than the situation he had been cautiously preparing himself for. "You sound surprised," Walter said. "Hoping and expecting are different things. I've learned not to confuse them." He came up the porch steps and shook Walter's hand with the firm grip that had characterized their first meeting. "You both look good. Better than October, honestly." "Sit down," Dorothy said, pulling off her gardening gloves. "I'll put coffee on." They sat on the porch in the thin March sun, cold still, but the bearable cold that carries in it the promise of what comes next, and Everett told them what he knew about Clarksburg. Conrad Hale's development project on the former Marsh Hardware building had formally collapsed in February. The foundation issues which the inspection report had characterized as minor, and which subsequent excavation had revealed to be significantly more extensive than the report had acknowledged, had produced a contractor lawsuit that was working its way through the county court system. The investors, 3 of them all from outside the county, attracted by Conrad's track record and his presentation of the opportunity, had pulled their commitments in January when the cost overruns made the project's economics unworkable. The building on 4th and Carpenter now stood as it had stood since Walter and Dorothy left empty windows boarded by order of the city after a section of partially demolished interior wall came down in a December windstorm chain-link fencing around the perimeter with a notice from the county building department attached to it. "People drive past it," Everett said. It's become a kind of landmark, the wrong kind. And Hale? Walter asked. He said it with the flat, informational tone of a man who wants the facts rather than any particular outcome. Restructuring is the word people are using. He has 3 other projects, and the money from this one was supposed to carry them through a difficult period. It went the other direction. Everett paused. My cousin hasn't heard him mention buying the cabin recently. Walter looked at the mountains. Pastor Norris resigned from Clarksburg Community in January. Everett continued. The church board commissioned an independent review of the building fund accounts after a longtime member raised questions. They found a pattern of expenditures that the board had not authorized. Not straightforward theft, apparently more a matter of decisions made unilaterally that used designated funds for purposes that served the church's public profile rather than its stated mission. Norris resigned before the board completed its report. The congregation has divided. About half of the longtime members have left to start a different kind of church on the east side of town. Smaller, less focused on appearances, from what my cousin says. Dorothy came out with 3 cups and distributed them without comment. She had heard. She sat in the 3rd chair and folded her hands around her cup and was quiet for a moment. I don't take pleasure in it, she said finally. To Everett, but also to herself, making sure the statement was true before she let it stand. People's lives falling apart isn't satisfaction. But I won't pretend I don't notice the shape of it. No, Everett agreed, but it's worth knowing. They sat in the quiet of the clearing, the 3 of them, and let the morning move around them in the unhurried way of mountain mornings that have not been organized around anyone's agenda. Before he left, Everett mentioned that he had purchased a piece of land 15 miles south down the valley, a small parcel with good water access, and a south-facing aspect that would make building practical. Thinking about staying in these mountains, he said, longer term, building something of my own. Walter nodded. Good land down in that valley. Yeah. Everett stood, set his cup down, looked at the cabin with its repaired roof and its full firewood racks in the garden area taking shape in the dirt. He looked at it the way someone looks at proof of something they needed to see proven. You 2 are the reason I'm thinking about it, in case that's worth saying. It's worth saying, Dorothy said. He drove back down the track, the sound of his engine fading gradually into the trees, and the creek ran where it ran, and the Hawks continued their slow reading of the thermals, and Walter and Dorothy sat on the porch of their cabin and let the morning be what it was. The letter from Renee arrived in April. It came through the rural carrier route 6 miles down the mountain, a postbox that Walter checked every 2 weeks, driving the truck down on the days the road was reliably passable. The letter had been forwarded through Everett, who had quietly passed the address along to Garrett during a phone call after his spring visit, recognizing that the family needed some way to reach their parents that didn't depend entirely on the brief text messages that had been the only contact since they left. It was the only link between the mountain and the children that any of them had thought to establish, and it had taken Everett to establish it. Walter read the letter at the table and then set it in front of Dorothy without speaking. Renee's handwriting was like her precise, efficient, organized, the kind of handwriting that communicates the character of its writer before the content of what they have written. She wrote that she and Garrett and Sylvia had talked, all 3 of them together, which was not something they did frequently. That they had decided to come all 3 at once rather than separately, which she acknowledged was a logistical imposition, but which she thought was the right approach. She wrote that she wasn't sure what to expect. And she wrote, and this was the sentence Walter had read twice before handing the letter over, I think I've been telling myself a story about what you needed that was really about what I needed, and I'm not sure that was fair to either of us. He appreciated the honesty. Renee had always been the most straightforwardly honest of his 3 children, even when her honesty was directed at things he found uncomfortable. It was a quality he had always respected more than he had said. They came on a Saturday in early May. Walter heard the cars before he saw them, 2 of them, because no single vehicle could carry 3 adults, and the weekend supplies they had apparently decided to bring, and the sound of 2 engines working carefully up the access track with the tentative caution of people who have never driven a mountain dirt road and are having their first conversation with the concept. He and Dorothy stood in the clearing and watched them park. Renee got out first. 48 years old, her mother's practical intelligence evident in the way she assessed the clearing before she looked at them, taking stock of the situation before responding to it. When she saw her parents, her face did something Walter had not seen it do in a long time. The controlled efficiency of her expression softened into something younger and less managed. Garrett came around from the second car. 46 years old, his usual presentation of studied professional confidence. Absent today, he was wearing jeans and a fleece jacket that still managed to look expensive, despite its intention, and he was thinner than Walter remembered, or perhaps simply more tired. The thinness that comes from running hard for a long time without adequate replenishment. He had the particular look of a man who has been winning by the metrics he knows how to measure, and has recently begun to suspect those might not be the right metrics. Sylvia came last. 44, the youngest, always the one who moved through the world on her own interior schedule. She stood at the edge of the clearing with her hands in the pockets of her jacket and looked at the cabin. The garden, the woodpile, the repaired porch, the mountains behind all of it, with the unreadable expression that had characterized her since childhood. Not cold, never cold, just private, conducting her accounting internally until she had completed it. "Mom," Renee said. "Dad." She crossed the clearing and embraced Dorothy, then Walter, holding each embrace longer than was habitual for her, long enough to be a statement rather than a formality. "You both look incredible. I wasn't expecting—" She stopped, started again. "What are you doing up here?" "Living," Dorothy said, simply without elaboration, letting the word carry the full weight of what she meant by it. They spent the first afternoon walking the property. Walter showed them what he had built and repaired and improved the firewood system, the water situation, the storage structures, the snare lines, the repair work on the cabin structure that had been accumulated across months of methodical attention. Dorothy explained the garden plan, the herb work, the root cellar, the preserved food system, the way the property's resources had been identified and cataloged and utilized. He watched his children absorbing it, watched the recalibration happening in their expressions as the situation they had come prepared for elderly parents in difficulty, a situation requiring management, a problem requiring solution, came into contact with the situation that actually existed. Two people who were by any honest observable measure doing better in every dimension than they had been doing in Clarksburg. That evening, with the pot-bellied stove running and all five of them arranged in the cabin's main room, Renee and Sylvia in the sleeping area, Garrett in the tent he had brought specifically because he had understood the cabin's dimensions. They talked in the way that requires something prior to it, something that clears the air of what has been unsaid. Garrett went first. He sat forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture of a man who has decided to say something true and is positioning himself to stay with it. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at Walter. "My blood pressure has been 160 over 100 for 2 years," he said. "I sleep 4 hours a night on a good week. Karen and I—" He stopped, started again with more care. "We're working on things. That's the honest version of a complicated situation." He looked at Walter steadily. "I spent a lot of years looking at you and thinking you'd made smaller choices, safe choices, that you hadn't pushed hard enough, taken enough risk, demanded enough from your situation." He paused for a long moment. "I don't think that anymore. I haven't thought that since I read the article about you, actually, but this—" He gestured at the cabin the mountains implied beyond its walls. "Seeing it, it's different." Walter looked at his son, Garrett, who had worked since he was 16, with a driven, unrelenting quality that Walter had always admired and always worried about in approximately equal measure. Garrett, who had been told often and consistently that his parents were proud of him and had somehow received that information in a way that converted it to pressure rather than comfort. "Garrett," Walter said, "I was proud of you before you made a single dollar. That part was never the condition. It was never supposed to be a condition." Garrett looked at the floor. His jaw worked for a moment. "The question I should have asked you a long time ago, and should have asked myself, is whether the thing you're working so hard toward is something you would actually choose if you stopped long enough to choose it deliberately." Walter let that sit for a moment. "That's the question I couldn't answer honestly in Clarksburg. That's why we left. Not because we surrendered, because answering it required being somewhere quiet enough to hear our own answers." Renee said, "I owe you an apology, both of you." She said it with the directness she brought to everything difficult, looking at them both. "The things I said after the store closed, the things I implied about planning, about decisions, about what you should have done differently. I was frightened, and I made my fear into judgment. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't right." Dorothy said, "You were afraid of what it meant. If it could happen to us people who had worked hard and been careful and done things the way you're supposed to do them, then it could happen to anyone." That's a frightening thing to understand. Fear makes people reach for explanations. It's easier to find a reason it happened than to sit with the possibility that it could happen to you too. "I wrote that email," Renee said, "to Garrett and Sylvia, about you being a burden, about needing a practical solution." "I know," Dorothy said. A beat of silence. "You knew Renee." Dorothy's voice held no reproach, no edge, nothing except the calm certainty of someone who has had a long time to process something and has arrived at a settled place with it. "I'm your mother. I've known most things about all three of you for longer than any of you are comfortable with." Renee put her face in both hands. Dorothy reached across and touched her arm, a gesture that was brief and sufficient. "We're not angry," Dorothy said. "We understand it, and we're here and you're here, and that's what this moment is. Let's be in it." Sylvia, who had been listening from the doorway of the sleeping area with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered to her, said simply in her quiet and precise voice, "I should have come sooner. I should have called more. I'm sorry." Just that, but she said it looking directly at both her parents, and the weight of it was exactly sufficient. "You're here now," Walter said. They stayed 2 days, and the 2 days were better than the circumstances of the visit had suggested they might be. On the second morning, Walter and Garrett split wood together for 3 hours. Not from necessity, the wood stores were more than adequate for the remaining cold of spring, but because Garrett had asked the previous evening whether there was something physical he could help with, and Walter had understood the request correctly. Garrett needed to work with his hands at something that had a clear result. He needed the particular satisfaction of a task that is finished when you can see that it's finished. They worked in the rhythm that physical labor with another person establishes on its own, without planning the maul rising and falling, the wood splitting along its grain with the satisfying crack of a clean, hit the pieces stacked in the growing pile with the care of men who understand that how you stack wood is a reflection of something about how you approach things generally. They worked mostly without talking the way men work when they're comfortable enough not to need the conversation to fill the silence. At one point, Garrett said, without looking up from the block he was setting, "How do you know when you've made the right call on something big?" "How do you actually know?" Walter considered this while he split a length of oak along the line of its grain, feeling where the wood wanted to go and directing the maul to follow it rather than force it. "You don't know," he said. "Not right away, sometimes not for a long time." He set the pieces on the stack. "But there's a real difference between doubt and wrongness. Doubt is just the absence of certainty, yet wrongness is something else. You feel it somewhere that isn't your head." "Where," Walter set another piece on the block, "somewhere that doesn't lie to you," he said. "The mountain taught me that. It doesn't have any interest in what you believe about yourself. It just shows you what you've actually done. The firewood is either stacked or it isn't. The roof holds or it doesn't. The preparation was enough or it wasn't. There's a relief in that kind of honesty. After a life spent in situations where everything is negotiable and perception matters as much as reality, there's a genuine relief." Garrett split his piece, added it to the pile, and stood looking at the stack for a moment. "I'm going to make some changes," he said. Not addressed to Walter specifically, more to the wood pile, to the mountain air, to whatever is listening, when a man makes a declaration of this kind in a place honest enough to receive it. "Good job," Walter said. He meant it without qualification. When the two cars drove back down the access track on Sunday afternoon, Walter and Dorothy stood in the clearing and watched them go. The sound of the engines faded, gradually absorbed by the trees, and then the clearing was quiet again with its own sounds. "They'll be all right," Dorothy said. "They will," Walter agreed with the confidence of a man who has assessed the evidence and reached a conclusion he trusts. The journalist found them in June. She arrived on foot, which Walter noted and respected. She had apparently driven to the nearest suitable pullout and walked the track the rest of the way, rather than risk her car on the soft sections, which demonstrated both sound judgment and a willingness to do the physical work that a story sometimes requires. She was perhaps 30 years old with a notebook and a small digital recorder, in the attentive, genuinely patient quality of someone who has learned that listening carefully produces better material than asking a lot of questions. Her name was Beth Salter. She wrote for a regional magazine based in Charleston, West Virginia. She had heard about them through Everett, who had mentioned them to someone he'd encountered on the trail, who had mentioned them to someone else in the way that stories about people doing something genuinely unusual travel through the informal networks of communities that pay attention to their own landscape. Walter and Dorothy were not enthusiastic about being written about. They sat with the request for a full day and discussed it that evening with the same directness they brought to everything that required a real decision. They concluded that if the story was going to exist in any form, and it had already begun to exist in the way that things exist when they start traveling through communities, by word of mouth, it was preferable to have it told accurately by someone willing to tell it honestly than to leave it to the version that Clarksburg had been circulating, which was the version of two elderly people who had failed and retreated and would be back. They gave Beth Salter 2 afternoons. She asked the right questions. She was interested not in the dramatic surface of the story, the loss, the departure, the survival winter, but in the texture beneath it. What does it feel like at 76 and 74 to start again from the beginning? What did you lose that you discovered you didn't actually need? What did you find that you had not expected to find? What would you say to someone standing at the same edge you stood at, looking at the same kind of choice? Dorothy answered most of the questions about the interior life of the experience, what the community's treatment had felt like, what the departure had felt like, what the daily life of the mountain had returned to her. Walter answered the questions about work. He said, "A man needs to make things, fix things, solve problems that have actual solutions, not just problems of management and perception and who thinks what about whom. Not everything in life has a real solution, but a split board has a real solution. A leaking roof has a real solution. When everything else feels above your reach, when the problems you're facing don't respond to anything you know how to do, fixing things that are within your reach keeps you honest. It keeps you connected to what you actually are. The mountain doesn't care about your theories about yourself. It just needs the firewood stacked and the roof sound before winter comes." Beth Salter wrote that down and underlined it. The article ran in the magazine's September issue under the title "Exiled or Liberated: A Couple's Life in the Appalachian Mountains." It was careful and honest and treated its subjects as people rather than symbols, which is rarer than it should be. It included one photograph taken by Beth on the second afternoon with a small camera catching them in an unposed moment of Walter and Dorothy sitting on the porch in the late light, both of them looking at the mountains rather than at the camera. The magazine syndicated the piece to a national publication. Walter didn't know this until Everett arrived on his next monthly visit carrying a copy of a magazine that neither of them subscribed to. "You're famous," Everett said with the dry, understated delivery of a man who grasps the irony of the situation. "Lord help us," Dorothy said, and meant it. Conrad Hale read the article on a Wednesday morning in September. He was in the waiting room of his bankruptcy attorney's office, a third-floor suite in the same downtown Clarksburg building where 18 months earlier he had stood at a podium and spoken to a small crowd of local reporters and city officials about revitalization and vision and what the future of Clarksburg could look like in the hands of people with the energy and the capital to move it forward. The press conference felt in retrospect like something that had happened to a different person in a different era. The podium and the reporter questions and the phrase strategic opportunity, all of it from another life. He had arrived early for his 9 o'clock appointment. The receptionist had left a copy of the regional magazine on the waiting room table, the issue with the photograph on its cover, two elderly people on a mountain porch looking at something the camera couldn't see. Conrad picked it up because he had nothing else to do with the 15 minutes before his attorney came out. He recognized the situation before he recognized the names. The hardware store, the building on 4th and Carpenter, the 40 years of family business that he had waited out patiently structuring his offer to take advantage of people who had run out of options acquiring the property at 60% of its assessed value because he had known, had understood clearly, and had not lost any sleep over that the owners had no remaining leverage. He read the entire article. He read about the hand pump and the letter in the cabin wall and what it had taken to get through the first winter. He read about what Dorothy had done during the 4 days when Walter's fever reached 105. He read Walter's line about the mountain not caring about your theories about yourself. He read Dorothy's line about being somewhere that didn't require you to apologize for existing. He read the paragraph, careful, factual, unnamed, but unmistakable, about the developer who had purchased the building and whose subsequent project had collapsed, and how the building now stood empty and boarded behind chain link fencing on 4th and Carpenter, while the people who had spent 40 years building it were living in the mountains and doing by every visible measure better than anyone who had profited from their necessity. Conrad Hale set the magazine on the waiting room table. He looked out the third-floor window at the street below. The ordinary Wednesday morning of a town going about its business. People moving on the sidewalks. A delivery truck making its stop in front of the building across the street. The parking meters and the storefronts and the infrastructure of an ordinary American small city, indifferent to the specifics of any individual situation and entirely uninterested in his. He thought about the press conference, about the way he had spoken about the building as though its previous occupants had simply been an inconvenient feature of the site rather than the source of everything about it that had made it worth buying. He thought about the phrase strategic opportunity and what it had meant to him at the time and what it looked like now from the other side of the accounting. He thought, and this surprised him because he was not a man who spent much time in this territory, about the two people in the photograph, about the woman sitting beside her husband for 4 days in a mountain cabin because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, about what 40 years of something looked like from the inside and what it was worth and what you were doing when you acquired it at 60% of value and called it an opportunity. His attorney came out at 9 o'clock and found him still looking out the window. She asked if he was ready. He said yes, he was ready, and stood and straightened his jacket in the automatic way of a man who maintains the forms of professionalism because they are the last thing that remains when the substance has dissolved. He walked into the office and began the process of managing what remained of the wreckage of his ambition. He left the magazine on the waiting room table for whoever came next, but he did not forget what was in it. Some things you read once and carry without ever deciding to carry them. They simply stay somewhere below the level of daily awareness as a piece of knowledge that revises how you see everything that comes after it. Pastor Norris came on a Thursday in October at the beginning of the second autumn. Walter was cutting back the spent growth in Dorothy's garden, the methodical end-of-season work of a gardener who was already planning next year, in the act of closing out this one, when he heard a car on the access track. He set down the pruning knife and watched it come into the clearing with the careful, unhurried pace of a vehicle driven by someone who was in no particular hurry to arrive. A dark sedan, Clarksburg plates. Walter placed the car before he placed the man inside it. He put down the pruning knife and waited. Pastor Norris had aged in the way that people age when they have spent significant time in genuine reckoning with themselves, not in the dramatic, visible way of illness or grief, but in the subtler way of a man whose relationship to his own authority has been fundamentally altered. He looked smaller than Walter remembered. Not physically, something else. He stood at the edge of the clearing in a dark jacket and ordinary slacks. No clerical collar, nothing that identified what he had been. "I should have called ahead," he said. "We don't have a phone up here," Walter said. "No." Pastor Norris looked around the clearing with the expression of someone taking stock of a situation that is not what he had imagined it would be. "No, I suppose you don't." Dorothy had come around from the other side of the cabin, drawn by the sound of the car. She stood beside Walter without particular expression, not hostile, not welcoming, simply present, waiting to understand what this visit was before she decided what it required. "Come up," Walter said. They sat on the porch. Dorothy went inside and came out with coffee, and they sat with it in the October chill. The birch trees at the clearing's edge in their full autumn color, the mountains in the distance wearing the yellow and orange and red of the season, with the casual abundance of something that does this every year without effort. Pastor Norris talked around the perimeter of what he had come to say for several minutes before he found his way to the center of it. He talked about the board's investigation, about the building fund review, about what the review had found. Not straightforward theft, he was clear about that, and the distinction seemed to matter to him. But a systematic pattern of decisions made without authorization using funds designated for specific purposes to serve the public image of the church rather than the actual mission he had pledged to serve. Small decisions, each one rationalized at the time, accumulating into something that could not be rationalized once you looked at the total. He talked about the resignation, about the congregation that had divided, about the months since which he described with the unornamented honesty of a man who has stopped trying to manage the impression he makes. I lost what I thought I was, he said. Not the position I understood I was losing when I resigned. The thing I thought I was, the identity. It turns out what I believed I was and what I actually was had diverged considerably over a long time without my noticing, or without my permitting myself to notice. He paused. Losing the first one was probably necessary. It just took longer than it should have and cost more people than it should have. A silence. I came because I need to say that what I did to you, what I said in that office was cruel. I've spent 8 months being honest with myself about this, and that is the accurate word. It was not a practical decision about resource management. It was a cruelty dressed in the language of management, performed by a man who was afraid of what your situation implied about the fragility of his own. He set his coffee cup down carefully. I'm sorry, both of you. That is what I came to say. Walter looked at this man for a long time. He thought about the church office and the practiced warmth and the eyes that had looked just above Dorothy's shoulder when she asked the direct question. He thought about the 47 years in those pews and the photographs on the fellowship hall walls. He thought about what it would feel like to carry resentment for that particular cruelty up a mountain and live with it in a small cabin through 2 winters and however many more remained. He thought about Clarence's letter, which was still on the table inside. The world will always have reasons for you to stay and diminish quietly. Resentment was one of those reasons. It would keep you small just as effectively as the judgment of others. Norris, Walter said, I accept your apology. He said it plainly without performance. Not because it's been fully earned, because carrying what happened in that office into whatever years I have remaining isn't something I'm willing to do. It's too heavy, and it earns nothing. Pastor Norris nodded. His jaw was set with the particular tightness of a man receiving something he's not sure he deserves. You didn't invent the system, Walter continued. You served it, and you served it in a way that cost people who had given you 47 years of their trust. You know that now. What you do with that knowledge is yours to determine. He looked at the mountains for a moment. But you drove up here. That's not easy, and it wasn't nothing. I'm starting again, Pastor Norris said. A small congregation in Harlan County, Kentucky. Rural community. They don't have much, and they're not expecting much. I've been thinking that might be exactly the right environment for someone trying to figure out what ministry without performance actually looks like. Probably is, Dorothy said. She said it quietly without judgment in either direction as a straightforward assessment of what he'd described. He left an hour later, driving carefully back down the access track. Walter and Dorothy stood on the porch and watched the car move through the trees until it disappeared. That took something, Dorothy said. Coming up here. It did, Walter agreed. Good, she said. And that was all. It was sufficient. By the third year, the life they had built had found its permanent shape. Walter was 79. Dorothy was 77. Their bodies communicated their ages with increasing frequency and specificity. Walter's knees requiring more deliberate management before and after demanding work. Dorothy's hands needing 20 minutes of careful movement on the cold mornings before they were reliable. They accommodated these requirements the way they had always accommodated the real conditions of their lives, honestly, without resentment, with the practical adjustments that the situation called for. Adjustment was not defeat. It was the appropriate response to accurate information. The garden was larger now, better understood in its particular soil and light and drainage, producing with the confidence of earth that has been worked and respected for 3 seasons. Walter had added a proper storage shed along the cabin's north wall, properly anchored and weatherproofed, in a covered workspace where he could do repair and construction work regardless of weather. Their approach to winter now was not survival management, but simply the ordinary preparation of people who live in a place with serious winters, comfortable and experienced without drama. Everett Dawes had built his cabin 15 miles south in the valley he had identified on that first visit, and he came monthly, usually staying a night or two, sometimes bringing news from the outside world, and sometimes not, because he had learned that they did not need the news to feel connected to anything. He had become the kind of friend that a man accumulates in his later years when he stops valuing convenience and starts valuing character. Rare, plain-spoken, genuinely himself in a way that required no management. On a Sunday morning in November, Renee came alone. She arrived without advance notice, which was unusual enough for Renee, that Walter paid attention to it. She had clearly been crying at some point during the drive, though she was entirely composed when she climbed out of the car, composed in the way of someone who has finished crying rather than someone suppressing it. She sat with them at the table and told them about the changes she had made. Not large changes in the external sense. She was not a person who operated in large dramatic gestures. Real changes. She had stepped back from a senior leadership role that had been demanding from her things she had gradually stopped believing the organization deserved. She had reconfigured her schedule in ways that returned some of her time to herself. She was sleeping better. She said with a careful half smile that was unmistakably her father's expression, working on the question of what she actually wanted rather than what she was supposed to want. "What moved you?" Dorothy asked. "What was the thing that finally made the difference?" Renee looked at her hands on the table for a moment. "The article," she said, reading it and seeing what someone who had no stake in the story saw when she looked at you two. Not the narrative I'd been running, the failure story, the pride story, all the ways I'd been framing. What happened as something to explain rather than something to learn from. Just two people who had made a genuinely honest choice. She looked up. "I've been making choices for a long time that I told myself were honest and were actually more about what I thought I was supposed to do." Walter said nothing. He let the silence do what silence does when the place is quiet enough to let it work, which was one of the things the mountain had taught him that he had not expected to learn. Later that afternoon, Renee was outside with Dorothy turning the garden beds for winter. The two of them working side by side with the easy collaboration of people who have found their rhythm. When Renee's son's 16 years old, lanky, in the way of teenagers who haven't caught up with their own height, yet came around from the truck where he had been reading and sat on the porch steps beside Walter. They sat quietly for several minutes. Walter had discovered over the past year that teenagers are actually capable of sitting in silence without the need to fill it, provided you don't make them feel observed or tested. He had always underestimated this about them. Then the boy said, "Grandpa, what's the bravest thing you ever did?" Walter looked at the clearing, at the woodpile with its careful geometry, at the cabin with its repaired roof and its straight chimney, at the garden beds that Dorothy and Renee were turning in the last of the November light, at the mountains going dark to the south and east, losing their detail to the early dusk. He looked at Dorothy, bent over the garden bed, saying something to Renee that made Renee laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of someone who is not performing anything. "Leaving," Walter said. He paused for a moment. "And staying with her." The boy was quiet, thinking about this. "Which was harder?" he asked. Walter gave the question the time it deserved because it deserved considerable time. "Leaving was harder at the moment it happened," he said. "It required something specific at a specific time, and that kind of thing is its own difficulty." He looked at the mountains. "Staying," he stopped, found the words. "Staying is harder over a lifetime. Choosing the same person, the same life you've built together every day. Not once. Every day. When things are difficult and when they're embarrassing, and when the world has decided you're finished and you're standing in a parking lot wearing someone else's name tag." He looked at his grandson. "That's not romance. That's not a feeling. It's a decision you make every morning. Some mornings it's the easiest thing on the list. Some mornings it's the hardest. But it's the right one. Every time it's the right one." The boy looked at the mountains for a long time, the way young people look at things when they are filing them away somewhere deeper than ordinary memory. "Okay," he said eventually. "Okay," Walter agreed. The sun went behind the western ridge at 4 in the afternoon at this time of year, and the shadow came across the clearing in a slow wave from the east, and the temperature dropped with it in the immediate noticeable way of mountain evenings that do not negotiate their transitions. Walter called to Dorothy that the light was going. She straightened from the garden bed, one hand going to her lower back in the automatic gesture of someone who has been kneeling, and looked at the sky, the ridgeline black against the remaining orange in the west. The first stars appearing in the deep blue overhead, sharp and undiminished by any ambient glow, because there was no ambient glow for miles in any direction. She said something to Renee, and Renee nodded and began gathering the tools. Then Dorothy walked across the clearing unhurried and came up the porch steps and stood beside Walter. They looked at it together. The way they had looked at the ending of days together for 53 years, the way that accumulates over 53 years into something that doesn't need to be named, because it is simply what standing beside someone means when you have done it long enough. The boy had gone inside. The mountains continued their work of being enormous and old, and entirely indifferent to the small, meaningful things happening at their base, which is exactly what mountains are supposed to do and exactly what Walter and Dorothy needed them to do. "Good day," Dorothy said. "Good day," Walter agreed. She took his hand which had built things and fixed things and lost things and found things, and held hers through all of it, the good decades and the bad ones, the years of building and the years of losing and the years of building again closed around hers in the way it always did. Complete, habitual, chosen. Somewhere in Clarksburg, the world continued its ordinary business. People made their accountings and measured their worth in the currencies that towns find useful, and told the stories that justify how they spend their time and attention and regard. The boarded building on 4th and Carpenter stood behind its chain-link fence in the evening, a monument to the difference between opportunity and wisdom. The divided congregation met in its two locations and worked on understanding what it believed when no one was watching. The traffic moved on Route 9 past the home base depot with its 80,000 square feet and its 47 checkout lanes and its fluorescent certainty about what home improvement means. Walter Marsh was not thinking about any of it. He was thinking about the roof flashing on the west corner that he had noticed lifting slightly last week and needed to address before the first snow. About the south garden bed that Dorothy wanted to expand in the spring, more room for the herbs that had proved most useful and most reliable. About the letter from Garrett that had arrived 2 weeks ago, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who was choosing his words with more attention than he used to describing the conversation he had finally had with Karen, the changes he was making to his schedule the morning he had woken up and decided to measure his life against different criteria. He was thinking about Clarence, who had come here alone and lived here alone and had left a letter in the wall of this cabin for whoever came next, for the people he had somehow known would eventually need to read it. He thought about his uncle, often now. He hoped that wherever Clarence was and whatever came after a life, he knew that someone had found the letter, that someone had listened, that someone had not waited quite as long as he had. He was thinking about what it meant to be 79 years old with the mountains going dark in front of you and your wife's hand in yours, and the knowledge, solid and unfashionable, the stone chimney at the end of the cabin, that you are exactly where you chose to be. Not where circumstance deposited you, not where you ended up, where you chose with full awareness of what the choice cost and what it offered to be. That was not nothing. At 79, with everything counted honestly, that was everything. The last light left the ridge. The stars came out over the Blue Ridge Mountains the way they came out every clear night at this elevation, undiminished. Specific, very old, each one in its place, the whole arrangement patient and permanent, in a way that puts the human accounting of success and failure into its proper proportion. Walter and Dorothy Marsh stood on their porch and watched them appear one by one, and then in their hundreds, the way they always did, in the way they always would long after any particular human story had finished. Still there, still together, still exactly where they had chosen to be, which was in the end the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The only choice that made every day for 53 years had added up to a life that was actually theirs. The mountains held the dark. The creek ran in the valley below. The stars continued their ancient, indifferent work. And on the porch of a repaired cabin in the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachian Mountains, two people who the world had decided were finished stood in the cold night air and breathed it in and remained stubbornly and completely and together alive.